Yeah.
Okay, it's 10:59, but it's live streaming, so I think we'll start.
Sure.
Perfect. Okay. So hi everyone. This week's Let's Talk theme is Let's Talk About Visions for Education. My name is Ella, and I'm here with two very special guests, Nayma Hasan and Roxy Cohen. Nayma Hasan is an educator in Karachi, Pakistan. Please correct me if I pronounce that wrong.
It's okay. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. Nayma works on academic coordinator and global politics instructor in a local school, while also working as an examiner, workshop leader, and curriculum developer for the International Baccalaureate Organization. Alongside her work in formal education, Nayma spends her time working with local stand-ups for skill development and cooperative capacity building. So she is amazing, and we're super excited to have her here today.
Thank you.
And we have Roxy Cohen also joining us, who is currently working on her PhD at education at York University, which is super cool, where she leads a team of professors, graduate students, community leaders, and educators in the development of the Youth Climate Change Leadership Certificate Program, Rooted and Rising, through the Young Lives Research Lab. She's been actively responding to climate change since grade 11, and in university, Roxy took part in social movements. Together with Nayma Hasan, Roxy co-founded Conscious Minds Camp and Co-op, also known as CMC. Nayma and Roxy, we're so excited to be talking to you today and had the opportunity to really engage in this conversation.
Thank you for having us
here.
Okay, so as normal, Fridays for Futures Toronto is going to start off a land acknowledgement. So before we start with our theme questions, we wish to acknowledge this land on which we're holding an online rally. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the land to work on. The land acknowledgement is about acknowledging the land, and unfortunately, alongside Indigenous peoples, Black voices have experienced erasure from our textbooks and from the way Canada constructs its own history and narrative. Do we know the story of African Americans spans 400 years and includes slavery, abolition, policing, urban growth, segregation, the civil rights movement, and long engagement in civics life? And that is a quote from Loris Hill. We also acknowledge the privilege of online space we have and the importance of using it to uplift voices and recognize the struggles that continue today of the Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. So before I start with the theme questions, I'm going to ask you both two questions about this. You can answer like Roxy can go answer the first two and then Nayma, or you can answer alternatively, whatever works for you guys. So the first question, I'll just ask them one by one so you don't get too confused because they're there's a lot. It's a pretty packed question. So how do you place yourself or reflect on what that land acknowledgement means to you?
So I can start us off with this one. So for myself, I come from settler roots. My ancestors on my father's side have been here as early as the 1800s on Turtle Island. As Jews, we kind of stand always in this in-between zone of passing as settlers and benefiting from settler colonialism, but not fully accepting, but still, getting all the white privilege and all of the benefits of genocide. So certainly land acknowledgements are really important for me to honor and remember those whose lands that I am on and whose stewardship really has enabled myself and my ancestors to thrive. And paired with that is then my responsibility as an individual to recognize the pain and the hurt and the death and the theft that has come with the way that I am able to live and the privileges that I enjoy, and therefore my responsibility to do what I can to grieve, to make sure that I am not committing deeper atrocities as I continue to step on this earth, and to do what I can to fulfill my side of the treaties and to fulfill my side of the Tugra Wampum and of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, which asked me to take from the land only what I need, to give back and to make sure that there's enough for everyone to eat, and really taking that as the basis of how I choose to live on Turtle Island and how I choose to step on this earth.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Nayma, would you like to go?
Roxy, if you left anything to say, that was amazing. No, I think for me, it's the recognition that as an immigrant, we moved to Canada with this image of Canada as the land of the free, of, while it may not have been the American dream because it's not the US, but we came with this aspiration for a better life, for a better world, because it was this picture of the ideal. When I moved, when I lived in Canada or Turtle Island, a lot of our learning or education that was through the public education system was completely encompassed a lot of erasure of these the indigenous people, and not just that, but the racism and the voices of Black people that have been silenced, and all of the torture, slavery, and brutality that has encompassed has been silenced. And those, recognizing those voices, those things, and recognizing that the Canada that I had, you know, I'm Canadian, but the fact that Canada was formed on all of these things is an important thing for all of us to accept and use going forward, not with these delusions of greatness in the sense of perfection and purity, but rather of what the past has had or done, but making sure that moving forward, we are working towards amending those wrongs that have been done before. And for me, I think my place is in recognizing that, especially as people of color, we don't necessarily get exposed to see that, because while there are still troubles and discrimination that we do face, especially as Muslim, it becomes very easy, especially given the media, to be disillusioned, led astray in terms of what actual facts are on this front. So definitely using my voice on this front. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask one last question about this, and then we will get into the sort of looking relevant questions about climate education and all that. Okay, so the next question I have is, what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this territory land acknowledgement?
Go ahead, Roxy.
No, you go ahead. Go first, Nayma.
Okay, I think it's just to make sure I'm never silenced about it. It's not necessarily that my voice is the one that needs to be heard, but that my voice is always used not on the side of the oppressor, but for the oppressed. It's to make sure that anything, like even our voices on social media towards our friends, are not just about posting what's trending or like the most recent issue, but about looking beyond what's happening, but towards systemic roots for all of these issues, and making sure my voice is used to bring light, but also enable others and give others agency to do something about it. And I think that's why I became an educator to begin with. But yeah, definitely, it's use the voice that we have.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, to add to that, because ditto. Yes, using my voice for sure. And I guess two pieces to add to that of my own kind of path and journey towards decolonization. One looking inward and one looking outward at how I act in the world. Inward, I think that as someone with settler roots and coming from ancestral traditions of benefiting and living on Turtle Island for so long, I have ancestral wounds to heal as well. And I have unlearning to do around my own beliefs, these teachings that the kind of system and media have ingrained in me, and to actually go back and do some of that like meditative and internal thought work to really uncover and unpack what are these kind of falsities, what are these barriers and separations that exist in the world, and how are they manifesting inside of me, inside my own thought processes, and how do I disrupt that? And then also on maybe the more spiritual and healing side, you know, what are the wounds and pains that are left in me from generations of conflict and of benefiting, and bearing witness to racism, genocide, and land theft. Because as someone who identifies and benefits from whiteness, you know, what happened to our ancestors that we thought it was okay to treat people like that? Like, what pains, what underlying falsities have we been bearing for centuries and generations that made it seemingly okay for folks to treat other human beings and to treat the earth that way? And there are things there for me to heal on my side, just as there are for my Indigenous family and my Black family and all of the people of color who have suffered the other side of the actual oppression. That there's healing for them to do. There's healing on my side too, and to meet that and to bear witness to that as well. And then on looking outwards at what do I do in the world to impact that. I mean, I think we're going to get into that conversation together in the rest of our call, because similarly to Nayma, like, these questions, that's what inspired me into education. That's why I'm an educator. I see the way that the current school system works as a colonial system, and I strive to create new systems that create different futures. That can take us out of colonial mindsets and out of colonial behaviors with one another.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. So I'm going to pass it on to Gabby, and I believe she's going to ask the next climate education related question.
Thank you so much for those answers. It's really important to us to go beyond our land acknowledgement. And I think something so important within those answers is just the theme of learning and also unlearning, which is definitely something we're going to unpack in our topic about climate education. So although we have our set questions for our weekly Let's Talks, we are just so appreciative that we can hold honest and educational conversations where our speakers and also our MCs can share their experiences. And especially with a topic like education, we really need everyone included in our conversation. So starting off, Roxy, what has your experience been like with learning about the climate crisis within schools?
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I'm excited to hear everyone else's replies on this as well. So we're having some great pre-chats and it's getting very exciting on these topics. So definitely school is the place where I first learned about climate change in a meaningful way. And it wasn't for me until grade 11 that I actually started learning about climate change. And also it was only in an elective course. So not all of my classmates actually got an opportunity to learn about climate change and what was happening. But I opted into taking an environmental studies course as well as a geography course. And both of those started to open up kind of what's going on with our planet and our impacts on it. And for me, what was most kind of like still sits with me when I think back on those experiences is the jarring nature that I was presented climate change with. There was nothing gentle about it. There was no space for any like, let's talk about our feelings around this. There was no kind of understanding that would be upsetting information for young people to learn. And the way that I learned about it was getting shown a series of documentaries in class over a few months about, the 100 different toxins in your house that are slowly killing you, and the 10 top ways that humans are destroying the earth, and all of these like very scary documentaries and really informative ones too, like The End of Suburbia, that really kind of opened my eyes, particularly at that point I was living in suburbia, to the entire oil and industry and the full kind of complex of our society. But there was no education on what to do about it. There was no, okay, here's what we're experiencing. How does that impact us as individuals? How were our families impacted? There was no kind of placing ourselves within the situation, and there was no space to respond. It was simply kind of like that standard model of let's learn about the problem, memorize it, and regurgitate it back out into papers and into exams. And that was pretty much it until I got into university. And in university as well, I was learning about climate change in human geography courses and equity studies courses at the University of Toronto, and getting really deep into it, learning a lot about the intersections, you know, of how colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy come together to like create climate change and kind of these real root causes of what's going on here. But again, the space for expressing feelings and kind of like moving through the emotional side of all of this, and also the space for dreaming and imagining and learning from others that have been successfully implementing ways of being that step us out of climate change and into harmonious living with the earth once again. We weren't studying that. And if we were, it was from a perspective of show me how they're really just perpetuating the problem, even though they think they're part of the solution, and that's how you get your A. It was a very critical approach that had like really strong benefits to it in terms of my learning of what is climate change, but left myself and most of my classmates at one point or another in our 4 years feeling very depressed, very hopeless, very kind of like disconnected from the real world and what really needed to be done. And that's kind of my experience with climate change and learning about it in schools, is kind of really learning some of the deep knowledge side, the science and the critical understanding of what's happening, and really not learning what to do about it or how to process my emotions.
Thank you so much, Roxy. All of that is totally true, and we're totally going to talk about that more. Nayma, same question for you.
Actually, my experience with climate change was very different. Climate change education. I wish I saw all of those things in high school. I think throughout high school and even like primary school, a lot of what we learned about climate change was, oh, you know, it's just that the weather changes, the polar ice caps melt. It's a very detached, but also like a very cold way of explaining things. Like, and as a matter of fact, like, oh, you know, this is just going to happen. It's happened before. We've had ice ages and this and that. It's just a normal way that the world works. But when we're actually looking at causes, oh, it's caused by this, and it's just like that humans have played. It's always been very downplayed, I find, and it's just in a very casual, matter-of-fact way, which I found very surprising. And for me, even when I studied at U of T, it wasn't until I took equity studies in like my 4th year that I came across something different. Even in the first couple of years, I was studying international relations and political science. So for us, it was like understanding climate change was like, oh, it's collateral damage. It's part of what we keep growing. And that's okay. That's just one of the costs that we have, like completely ignoring the environmental costs of everything that is actually happening. And for me, that was actually very difficult to see, because while all of this was happening, I had seen floods, I had seen droughts happening in my country, and understanding through my own personal exploration about the way in which climate change is actually taking place and our impact in it, and our absolute ignorance of what to do about it. Like Roxy rightfully said, we've never been equipped with any tools in terms of what we need to be doing about it, how we need to be doing anything about it. There was no agency, student agency or involvement in how we can take this knowledge forward. And I think that's generally, whether we look at any of the problems, that's been an underlying pattern that's very common in all of these issues. And so we do need a much more solutions-based approach. I wish, you know, I think maybe if we even had more of, you know, those documentaries Roxy mentioned earlier, to have that kind of rude awakening, it might have fostered more of it. We should definitely have been seeing that, not just as optional, but, you know, for us, it wasn't even something to consider. And that's why so many people go so far without actually understanding the actual impacts that it's having, and they're so disconnected from the reality around them.
Thank you so much for those answers, Nayma and Roxy. I'm going to share my experience too, just because we all have to be involved with this, obviously. Ella, you can as well. So Ella and I are both in high school, and I can speak from my elementary school experience as well, is that it was very much reduce, reuse, recycle based. It was very like, let's do these things at a constant, but not really know what's going to come out of it. We just know that it's good. And we kind of talked about how to do that more within schools, not when we go home, not when we want to go out. It was more just like in schools, let's reduce, reuse, recycle, which is great, but it's a very, very, very small portion of the climate crisis. And I didn't even really learn about what was going on. I was just kind of like, the world is warming, but these things, we're just going to keep it the same because it's good. But then I think when we came into high school, and I only learned about climate change at the very end of this year's science course, and it was for a very, very short time. It came in very quickly. It was all like, this is the situation. And we kind of just stopped there. It was a lot, but we did just stop there. It wasn't really going beyond it, which is something we're going to talk a little bit about in our next question. But yeah, it was all very scary, obviously, but we kind of wanted that next part of, so what are we going to do about it? Because we can't just reduce, reuse, recycle until we stop these very, very scary things that we are hearing. And Ella, you can touch on this as well.
Yeah, so I'm an immigrant. I'm first generation Canadian. I'm from England originally. So I did half my schooling in England and half my schooling in Canada. And it was essentially the same, like ditto to what Gabby said. Very animals are losing their habitats and the earth is warming, but recycle your paper, reuse your clothes, and it's all going to be fine, which it's not. And then I remember back April of 2019, I read an article about how we have until 2030 to cut emissions by 50% if we want a sustainable chance at fighting the climate crisis, and not even stopping it, but postponing it. And I had a complete meltdown because I hadn't heard any of this before. Even in science class this year, the end of this year, we did a climate change unit where we learned about eucalyptus leaves and weather versus climate definitions. And that was it. And it was utterly terrifying, sort of having to do this research by myself. And I have people come up to me and speak to me about the climate crisis, and I give them these facts that, reduce, reuse, and recycle isn't enough. There are like 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. It's such much of a bigger fight. Like, call these companies out, get involved in climate activism, join the climate fight. At the end of the day, flipping over your paper to the other side or using a metal straw isn't enough. And that really freaks people out, realizing that they haven't had this proper education of what to do and the severity of what's happening.
So yeah, clearly we're a little bit delayed in this, and it's very, very scary to think that there are still kids and younger than us and still kids our age learning these things, and they're in for a very, very rude awakening. And I think that when I guess the world started to wake up in a way, even though the climate crisis has been ongoing for so very long, there'd be mention of it. But yeah, like Ella said, we had a very, very small portion of this year's science that was it, dedicated to climate change. But there's just so much more we can do. But I'm going to let Ella touch on that in the next question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
before you
okay.
get to that next question, Ella, I just want to make a quick comment as well, just to note that, there's about 10 years between us, give or take. It's been 10 years-ish since Nayma and I left high school. We're not quite the same age, but give or take that, Mary. And, you would hope to see giant leaps of change in the curriculum during that time in terms of what we're learning, particularly as an increasing amount of international declarations are being signed, an increasing amount of climate change education is being developed, and it is enraging to hear about your experiences in high school.
I can imagine.
That are really not that much different than what Nayma and I described, and I think that's important for us to take note of. It's been 10 years. This change is
Yeah,
not.
10 years.
In those 10 years, think of how much technology has changed, and yet there's zero change on this front. And that's the scary part. We have the tools, we're just not doing anything with them.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying. Which leads into the next question about sort of like evolving your thinking and all that. Even though the school systems haven't been doing that for us, which is, what does climate activism teach you that schools don't? So I know for myself personally, as I spoke about, I learned, about eucalyptus leaves and that the earth was warming. So you flip your paper to the other side. But I didn't learn about A, the severity of it, B, really how to help it, but C, also that the climate crisis was a human rights crisis as well, that those least responsible for climate change suffer the greatest consequences, how intersectional it is with BIPOC people, like even with COVID is a prime example that most of the COVID cases in Toronto are in BIPOC communities because of the internalized systemic racism, or that LGBTQA plus teens face it a lot because of the homophobia. They're thrown out into the streets and forced to face these consequences of the climate change as well. I remember when I first moved from England, I lived by the beach, and every single pier was out of water. And I go down now, and I think there's about 2 that are not completely submerged anymore. So I'm going to pass that on to either Nayma or Roxy or Gabby, whoever wants to answer it first.
Roxy, why don't you take it a go this time?
Sure. So we're talking about what do social movements and youth movements offer me in learning that the school system did not. So much humility, courage, my sense of who I am in the world and what my purpose is, what my gifts are on this planet. These are things that school did not help me to discover, but that my time working and fighting alongside other youth and other folks working for a better world have. I think just like on a basic level, it can be brought down to the word of experience. Like schools are in certain buildings and they, operate through books and the written word and all this sort of things that don't give a lot of space for learning through experience, and particularly when it comes to creating a world learning through trial and error. It's definitely been one of my biggest lessons of being a part of various social movements and social movement spaces, that just because I want to be respectful, just because I want to like live, perfectly in balance with my fellow human beings in the earth, it's not actually that simple. And it's a lot of unlearning, like we were talking about before, but it's a lot of work, and I'm not going to get it right because I wasn't programmed that way. Like I wasn't raised in how to live that way. I was raised in how to live a different way. So learning how to actually live in respect for others and respect for the earth, like I made mistakes. I continue to make mistakes along the way. And like my social movement spaces have enabled me to make those mistakes, to heal from those mistakes, and to learn and move forward. And that's very different than the school system, where I just get an F or a D for my mistakes and told to, feel bad and move on. And that real kind of learning that like, okay, we have to like just start doing it. And then we're going to mess up, and then we got to get better, and then we're just going to do it again, and then we're going to get better and better and better. That kind of attitude and that way of approaching these social changes and environmental changes that we need has been what I've found outside of school. And really that piece of like how to work together, how to work across different cultures, across different experiences, across different everything. I mean, especially in Toronto, but around the world, like we are so diverse. And working together across that diversity also takes experience and also takes kind of like lessons and learning from our elders and learning from systems that have come before us in the social movement spaces. And that is also something that I did not learn at school, and is probably one of, if I was to name like the top 3 skills that young people should be learning to address climate change, taking conflict and learning how to deal with conflict as a lesson and as a healer rather than as something bad, and learning how to work across different worldviews and across diversity would be in those top skills. And those are things that didn't learn at school, but definitely learned in the streets.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. Practically the same stuff, but also I think a lot of it was our school cultures are largely driven by competition. It's about pitting one person out or the other. It's about this, in order for me to come first, someone else has to come second. And a lot of that meant, competing with one another, fighting one another, whether it was, a clean fight or a dirty fight, it didn't matter. But we were so focused on just our individual gain that we lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think that's one of the things that you can see in a lot of social movements as well, is that a lot of times what perverses them is that need for the individual to find their own, use their voice to be heard, and recognizing that our voice has value, but doesn't necessarily need to be the one that's being followed every time. And being able to give that space leadership, you know, and how a good leader is not really a dictator, but one who brings everyone together, brings all perspectives together. We can see it in the, like, every other part of society where there are certain voices who constantly get shut down. And our space, when we're creating any social justice movement or in any space really, our focus should be in making sure all voices have space in there, and that any decision that gets made is cognizant of those voices, whether it or not it necessarily acts on all of them, because realistically that's not necessarily always going to be possible, but making sure that there is enough, like, just compromise taking place, and being able to come to those compromises is often very difficult and not something we learn in school at all. I'm not even going to get into the actual real life skills of, like, you know, being able to do something that school doesn't teach us. But yeah, I think, Roxy, you hit the nail on the head when you said it's the communication is definitely the top one. I think besides communication, even in terms of, I think school allows us to believe a lot of what we learn. Like, we don't learn critical thinking at all, or not well in schools often. Especially, I find that the case here especially, but that it's, okay, whatever we hear on the news or, you know, social media, a lot of times it just gets taken as a fact. Whereas if you actually dig deeper into the issues, you'll learn that things are a lot worse or a lot more convoluted than they're presented, and we're not taught to think critically. Or even understand the complexities of situations as they exist. Just taking the example of, like, you know, as a global politics instructor, I teach a lot about protests and social movements, and a lot of times we completely, you know, we romanticize, oh, you know, we're just going to go out on the streets for a couple of days, we're going to scream and yell and make some noise, and then the government, and we're going to, you know, have the happy ending we were looking for. Whereas in reality, that's not how it looks, and that's not necessarily the backlash you get in reality is often very different, very violent, and you don't see that until you're actually on the ground doing something. And how the people who are supposed to often benefit from this may also be the ones that stand against it because they've been so misinformed about everything. So all of these things, misinformation, critical thinking, oh yeah, the list goes on. We can talk about this for days, but I'll stop here.
Yeah, I was going to answer this question too, just because being with MFF and other groups as well, I've learned so much about the climate crisis, which I did not learn in schools. And I think you both answered so wonderfully. And there are just so many ways that the climate crisis intersects with our school as well, and just the world in general. And it's like a lot of information to take in all at once. And I think definitely being part of like a big climate movement, I wasn't really even aware there was a movement until I heard about Greta Thunberg for the first time. Even though we'd hear about, you know, scary natural disasters, I don't think a lot of us made that connection that this is what it's for and that it's so serious. And also, like Ella mentioned, how it intersects with BIPOC communities and viruses now, and like there's just so many places to go. And I think school really kind of shuts it down at one point. And like you mentioned as well, Nayma, in terms of leadership, we're taught to compete and fight for these spots. But once we get to these spots, we have to bring community together. But we're taught to fight with our community to become the leader of one. It's very, very odd. And also, we're not really sure what we're even leading at one point. And that's also really scary as well, to think, where do we even go with this information? How do we deal with this kind of overload of information as well, which is something we talk about a lot, which we all, you know, we all check in on each other in our climate orgs, because it's just so much when it comes to organizing and, you know, just talking about these difficult things. And I mean, the list of where it intersects goes on for days, but it's definitely something that has to be talked about, and definitely in schools as well. And I know, Nayma, you also mentioned like with the media and the government. I think like the media and the government are words that are just thrown around so carelessly in school as well, when we really have to realize what the media is telling us and what they aren't sharing, and also how we can hold the government accountable, because they have a lot of power that we just think like is kind of capped to a point, but we can really, really use that to our advantage. And if you're okay with it, I'm just going to move on to the next question. but this is such an important question as well. So Nayma, as an educator in Pakistan, what differences have you noticed in learning and teaching about the climate crisis between different countries? And also Ella, if you'd like to answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this a little earlier as well. But largely it's taking it so matter-of-factly as opposed to taking it as a matter of emergency, that the climate emergency is an actual emergency. We may see wars as an emergency, but the fact that climate change is an actual emergency that is going largely unaddressed. And it really is not brought up in that capacity or to that extent in the education systems. Like I said earlier, it's okay, you know what, because it's also taught in a way that's so disconnected. I think for us, like Karachi, where I teach and live, is a desert. So for kids to understand polar ice caps melting, it's like, oh, okay, you know, it's something that's just happening at another part of the world, where they're completely detached from that experience. Whereas the education about climate change should be a lot more place-based, and for them to be able to actually understand that it has to do with, you know, the droughts that we face, the floods that we face, the erratic rain patterns that we experience, whether we're talking about this pandemic, and, you know, so much more goes into it that they're so disconnected from, because what they're using are, you know, decades old textbooks, which I'm sure are still like textbooks that we would have learned in, you know, back in our day. I didn't study here in primary school, but I'm sure they're the exact same textbooks. And that's what's the scary part often as well, is that because all of this is not changing, and the severity of the situation, none of that's actually being brought forth, but the place that students are actually finding a lot of their agency on all of this, and I won't necessarily say agency, but it's just more awareness of it, is it's through social media. It's through Instagram, by following people like Greta Thunberg and by following other climate change activists, as opposed to schools where they're actually paying money. And well, here, because a lot of the kids go to private schools here, they're paying money to get an education, and it's not like it's cheap. They're paying a lot of money to get this education, which has no value for them in real life besides getting them into a university, which is going to do the same thing to them. And it's largely just, oh, you know, don't waste water. And a lot of the things that you just said, like earlier as well, like reduce, reuse, recycle, don't waste water, you know, don't use disposable spoons and forks. And yes, that's all great, but none of this, nowhere do these issues get addressed in looking at the actual underlying systemic factors. And the problem with that, I think, largely has to do with the fact that these subjects have been, like, they're huge silos that are drawn between subjects. So while we may talk about climate change as part of ecology or the environment in biology, you're not actually looking at the politics of it all. And when it's taught in politics, you're looking at how people, or, you know, what impact it's having, how it's happening, but you're not actually understanding why or what we can do about it in terms of, you know, the science behind it. And because the learning in these education systems is so I don't know what the right word is. I'm saying it wrong. Isolating, sorry. So because of that, it becomes very hard for kids to even draw those links between them. And that's I find that that's one of the biggest issues with the education system here when dealing with climate change as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nayma. I think those big gaps are just so significant. And I also know, like, growing up in a very privileged community where BIPOC voices were never honestly uplifted or even talked about at all, because the climate crisis is very different for BIPOC people as well. It's just so many different gaps, and we kind of learned where to start and where to stop, and we just thought that all this is normal and not where things could have been changed, not where the science actually could have changed if other people took action and raised their voices. Ella, if you'd like to speak on this as well, you're totally welcome, because I know you're from England, or you can just move on to the next question.
Hence the super British accent. No, I lost that a few years ago. But yeah, it's a weird subject. The thing with Canada and England is that England's school system is very strange, where the typical public school in Canada is about as good as a really expensive private school in England. So it's this strange of, the more privilege you have, the more education you get. And again, that's with the systemic racism as well, because what I've noticed about Canada and England is England is blatantly racist, and Canada it's a really racist country, but it's more, they try and hide it a little bit more, if that makes sense. So I got more of an education on the climate crisis in Canada than I did in England. England's also, from what I've noticed from living there and being born there and all that, a very patriotic country, and a large percentage of the population is older people, which probably explains a lot of that. So it's a lot harder to have your voice listened to as a youth. Whereas in Canada, the government seems a little more willing to listen. And I use seems there as the key word because I find a lot of the activism in Canada is incredibly um, performative. But the education I got in both was about the same. I mean, England's a tiny, it's an island. It's surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean. If this keeps up, it's going to be completely submerged at one point. But nobody really seems to be willing to um, acknowledge the severity of what's going to happen. I think it's a bit of a denial stage of it as well. And same goes with Canada. In both countries, it was a very sort of like, the earth is warming, animals are losing their habitats. You know, if you just recycle and put stuff in the recycling compost, it'll all be fine. Don't worry about it. And it's not until I really got into climate activism that I had this rude awakening moment, realizing I'm not going to live to see like 40 at this rate. I don't want to have children because I don't want to bring them into a world where their future is uncertain and they're not guaranteed to live a full, fulfilling life. And going back to the past question, I think that's really what climate activism taught me as well, was in schools, they teach you what's happening to an extent. Even Gabby brought up natural disasters, but a lot of these natural disasters are triggered effects because of human action with the climate crisis. So we learned a lot about, you know, as I said, just the polar ice caps are melting, donate to the polar bears, it'll all be good. But I never really learned what to do, especially once you get higher up onto this level of activism, how to really handle that. I mean, I'm 16 and I already have like politicians coming for me. And that's kind of a weird thing. They don't teach you that either. It's like, okay, great, take action. Now what? How do you handle this? How do you keep going?
Yeah, thank you so much for all those answers. Once again, all these questions could just sadly go on forever because there's so much that these learning as institutions really are not teaching us. And it's kind of scary that these places where we just want to learn, we just want to know more, and we go there to learn, we're missing out on so many things that intersect with almost everything that we're learning in school as well. I'm gonna, Ella, do the next question now.
Yeah, okay. Oh, where did it go? Wrong one. Okay, so with the COVID-19 pandemic, let's talk about a just recovery and an extremely relevant in terms of education. So Roxy, how do you think we can change our curriculum to make it more climate orientated when students return back to school? What should school look like? So I know for myself personally, I've been all about the just recovery and pushing for that and a Green New Deal, and justice for all, and you know, Bill 197, and how that's super unjust, and we're trying to change that. But for myself, I think I'd really like to learn about, like Gabby mentioned, we have a civics and careers course where we learn about like how to be a good citizen and the different levels of the government. But for myself, I'd really like to learn about, you know, how much power does this group of people have over us? Why are they all white and male? Like, why are we prioritizing bailing out mass corporations while we're selling the youth's future away?
Yeah, so much there. I mean, this is the exciting question. This is where we get to have some real fun on the call together. And I'm excited to hear from everyone on this call too. Like, okay, we've talked about, you know, what our education system is lacking, but let's do some dreaming work now. You know, what do we want our schools to look like? What should we be learning? What does that look like? And I think, you know, COVID-19 offers a really interesting opening in a lot of ways when it comes to education. You know, as we struggle to go back into school buildings and have these tensions around young children wearing masks all day long, and the uncomfortabilities of being together in these closed spaces, it perhaps provides an opportunity for us to think about the relevance of school buildings in the first place. What is the function of having a separate building where children are learning in? It removes us from the rest of society. It takes us and puts us separate from what's going on in the world, literally, physically, right? The way that the school classroom is set up, the way that, chairs are often set up, the whole architecture of a school building really prepares children and youth to step into workplaces, to step into factories, to step into management roles, depending on kind of what level of the school system you're in, and kind of to replicate the very architecture that built those schools in the first place. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to push back and say, we don't want to be learning in buildings. We want to be learning in the places where life is happening. We want to be learning alongside changing and alongside creating the kind of world that we want to live in. There's a really interesting new school in Toronto that's just opening up for its first year called CAST, City as School something, and they've decided with all of this push, they're going partially online learning and partially actually learning in labs, in museums, in workplaces, in places. So it's place-based learning, as Nayma was talking about earlier, and online learning as this kind of combo. And I think these sorts of models can help us open up this understanding of what do we even want our education system to be doing. Because if we even think back to COVID, did schools prepare us to deal with a pandemic? Did you have your emergency network in place? Did you have your 3 weeks of food supply and water? Did you, know what a state of emergency even means? I certainly didn't. And I've been preparing and thinking about this for years, right? So, it just opens up these understandings. Okay, clearly our systems aren't working. Clearly our food system is not working very well. COVID, climate change made that obvious. We knew this already. World hunger made that obvious. We have enough food. It's not a matter of that. It's how we distribute it, why folks go hungry around the world. And then with COVID, it kind of added in this extra layer of really exposing, food import and export systems and how dependent we are on other places to even feed ourselves. And opening up spaces for shifts in that too. Who's working our farms? How does food grow in the first place? Where are our students in our schools in all of this? Do you know how to grow your own food and how to support a farmer? These are questions for us to continue asking. And I think COVID kind of provides that opening to say, okay, we've stepped out of that normal. Everyone else was talking about that. Let's use that language. Okay, we've stepped out of the old normal. And what does this new normal look like? What do we want it to look like? And I think it's really, this really fascinating time for young people to step forward and say, actually, this is what we want to be learning. Actually, clearly, you don't know how to prepare us for this thing called life. Here's what we need to be doing. And for me, when the question is what is that we should be learning? Again, that place-based element, but definitely thinking about having our schools and our students actively working with governments, with businesses, with families, with communities, with nonprofits to shift the ways that we're living and to learn by actually doing, practicing, trying, researching ahead of time to know that kind of, what's necessary in these moments. And to really start to imagine our schools and young people as this incredible source of inspiration, of power, of these places where people already are used to gathering, are used to thinking about as kind of wholesome places of family and community and all of these things. And how do we activate those spaces and those relationships that already exist? To really create the food system that we actually want, create the justice system that we actually want. What does restorative justice look like when our court systems are closed? Great. We don't want that same system anyway. Let's talk about restorative justice. Let's go learn from the Indigenous peoples. Let's go learn about how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy kept peace on this land before colonizers arrived. And where were they learning? Where were students learning before industrial schools? And it certainly wasn't in segregated buildings. separate from the rest of society. And again, for me, this is a real moment and a real opening to say, okay, that's not working. Let's take a different path, and radically quickly too. I'm gonna throw it to Nayma there, because I feel like, yeah, you're like bursting with things to say as I'm chatting.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And we have to, when you were talking about what the purpose of schools are, but also how did they come about? A lot of our schools, and I look at Pakistan, but elsewhere as well, are leftovers of colonization. Their role was to teach us to be a certain way, to act a certain way. And a lot of how or what's taught has not changed, or the system of learning has not changed. And all that education was meant to do was teach us how to be great servants. And I'm sorry, but that's not who I envision my students, or myself for that matter, being. That's not the world I want to create, definitely. And so I think a lot of it has to do with even opening our eyes up to that fact. And so in order to change all of those things, we must recognize what the system is doing and how we must change it. Now, again, a lot of what Roxy said I completely agree with. Students play an active role in all of this. But I think one of the things that I would like to add is the space that needs to be given to mental health. I know a lot of disruptive behavior in schools is like completely disconnected from its actual mental health roots, and taken as, this kid is like a delinquent, or he's just a rowdy child, or he's just a violent child, without actually understanding the mental health aspects of it. Even in this pandemic, people are struggling with depression, with anxiety, and all of these really valid feelings and conditions, because of the fact that schools have really not prepared us to deal with all of these kind of things, or for change, with any sort of change whatsoever. We're taught to be comfortable with this routine, in this whole conveyor belt kind of style, where it's like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, repeat. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, repeat. And so because of that, there's such a norm that's created that anything that's outside of that, we're not used to or able to even cope with it. And I think part of changing all of this is stepping outside of that routine. I can tell you, I'm sure, like when we talk about literature, for example, it's the same kind of books that are taught all over the world. Everyone's reading Shakespeare, everyone's reading these same cliche books. Why are we not doing more listening to different voices? It's not like, dead British people are the only ones who've actually written anything, and there's a lot more that students can read that would relate more to what they're learning, what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And a part of what education should look like has to do with finding that new normal, but also what parts of this pandemic break that we've gotten that we want to keep. Because a lot of what education also is a lot of stress on students, especially to get into university, because it's like, it's not enough for you to get A's and everything. You need to be doing 20 extracurricular activities so your application sticks out above everyone else's. But with the climate, with this COVID-19 crisis, it's forced everyone to slow down. And actually, you'll see so many people picking up new skills or new interests. And I think that's what education is actually supposed to be doing. And so in a way, this pandemic has taught us a lot more than schools were. And I think that's really something, don't get me wrong, I'm not really happy about the pandemic, but those are things that we need to hold on to and take with us forward, moving forward from this crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. And I want to pause for a moment too on this mental health point that you raised, and the importance of schools being able to offer emotional support space for students, for faculty, for families as well. And it brings up one of the most, to me, crucial and interesting challenges of shifting our schools towards climate change as well, and addressing climate change, which is this emotional and dare I say it, spiritual side as well, that our schools in this kind of secular era are so afraid to approach. And it makes it really hard to deal with the whole side of climate change, because climate change brings species loss, brings human loss, and therefore brings death. Death brings grieving. Grieving brings culture and religions and spiritual practices, and these things that our schools are really afraid of, like touching and engaging with. Oh, I feel like I'm freezing here. And a big question for me in climate change education and what do our schools look like is like what do those spaces look like? What does that healing space look like in schools that can hold all of our diversity without imposing any particular practice on folks, but that doesn't pretend like spirit doesn't exist, that doesn't pretend like our emotions don't exist, because they do, they're with us. And how can we open up that space, and what does earth healing, like what does it mean to heal our relationships with the earth during school hours together on the land, in our different spiritual realities and our practices that are, you know, different with different families, but and some of that being like atheists as well. Like, how do we hold space for all of that while we heal this side, and while we give that emotional and spiritual support work as well, that's just totally lacking in schools right now. So thanks so much for Nayma for bringing that up. It's point weighs heavily with me.
But you know, another thing that I just thought of is also the emphasis on conformity that comes in schools, and just that absolute requirement, and a lot of times, like, because of the fact that we're all different, we don't, and that's also really closely interlinked with mental health, with spirituality, with different cultures. It doesn't give a lot of space to anyone who's just remotely different. I remember when I came into when I moved to Canada, I was in grade 2. And I think for a good 2 years, it took me about 2 years to actually make friends, because of the fact that the school that I went to was just largely different from me. And not just the teachers, but the students didn't know how to deal with someone that was just so different from them. And I think for me, it's been a blessing in the long run, because I've gotten used to like walking into spaces where I stick out, which is great for me. But I mean, I think for most people that becomes really difficult, because they don't know how to deal with situations like that. And I mean, imagine like 2 years or a couple of years without having any actual friends becomes a really difficult situation for little kids, especially if they don't have the kind of support systems at home or outside of the school anyway to provide that. And the fact that kids aren't taught to deal with those kind of differences, because there's that drive towards conformity, it creates a lot of clashes within or difficulties for students. So yeah.
I'd love to add on just both to what both of you said, an emphasis on add on, because what you have said is just, it's so validating and it's so interesting and important. And it's like, I just want more people to listen to that. And I just think to add on to this whole mental health topic, it's extremely important, as well as in the activist community. We're always yelling at politicians and doing really, really large, important things. But at the end of the day, we have to just sit with ourselves and really, really think about, honestly, our purpose, which is like very scary and something that I know a lot of high school students deal with anyway. And it's also scary mental health wise, thinking we have to learn about our history and all these very bad and very difficult to hear, like colonial roots, which is where we come from, to be honest. Most of us come from. And then we have to think about our present and this normal. We have to learn a lot about the normal to actually break the normal, which can be extremely scary as well, to really think how we're conforming to all of this. And then we have to think about our future, which is even more scary, and kind of the direction that we're heading. And all of these layers can have super, super big impacts on your mental health. I don't know one person in the activist community who hasn't had that kind of many, many mental breakdowns, just worrying about all of this, because it's very normal to worry about. And like you said, Roxy, when we're brought into these separate institutions, we're supposed to be learning, or we're supposed to be preparing for the outside world, but yet we're so detached from the outside world. It's a very, very cruel irony, and it's really, really scary. And yeah, oh God, I don't even know what to add, but what you said is just so true. And we can go on so much. And I think just to add on to what Nayma said, we just really, really need a lot of different kinds of people just coming together and really forming a sense of community with whatever we choose to talk about. And we have to realize that once we start, there's really no stopping. Obviously, we have to be optimistic. We have to pace ourselves in this movement for better education. It's so much more to go from better education, but so much better everything. So yeah, we really have to pace ourselves. Yet at the same time, it's just a lot to be learning for so long in this institution, but then leaving, realizing that maybe you actually haven't learned as much as you wish you would, and about things that you think are more significant to right now. Anybody can add on, obviously, because such a big conversation before we get to the next question.
Yeah, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I just want to pick up really quickly on one thing you just said, Gabby, because it hurt my heart. Um, and this element of like learning what our purposes are and what your gifts are in this world. I just feel like hearing someone who's in the process of finding that, like calling that process scary, is just such a reminder to me that this is one of like the biggest atrocities of our school system, is that it does not help us learn what our gifts are to give to this world and how to do that and how to be our own kind of leader. Like Nayma was talking about, we're so used to following one type of leader. There's so many different types of leaders, and some of us even lead with our emotional vulnerability and are kind of that first one to break down and show the world that it's okay to feel. And like, that's a gift. That's a style of leadership as well. And like, what should our schools be doing? What should we be demanding in our schools? Like, oh my gosh, where are our mentors? Why are we not getting connected with people who care in our communities, who have similar gifts that can help us find that? Because it should not be scary. This is what school should be for. This is what a young person becoming an adult is all about, is connecting with other adults and like finding what your particular gifts are and how you're meant to bring those forward in the world, because that's where we get our source of happiness, our joy, our sense of like why we're here, and it just struck me so hard when you said that. And I'm going to stop talking now because we're running out of time, but
That's totally fine. It's totally fine. It is scary that it's scary. That should be the last thing that it is, to be honest. And I know like Ella and I both go to an arts high school where so much individuality is just pressed onto us, which is incredible, but it's also very scary as well to see where we stick out from all of this talent and a lot of what we're all interested in, because not only do we do arts, everybody's interested in different things. It always seems like there's a cutoff. But at the end of the day, there's really no cutoff. We're all in the same school. We're all on the same earth. We all have to take care of ourselves, but also our community. And so, like I said, with the climate crisis intersecting with so many different things, we really kind of have to figure out where we intersect as well, and how we can't, well, what school teaches us, I think, is that we have to break the communities that we're in to start leading those communities. So learning about our past leaders and learning about how current leaders have gotten to their places is really, really scary. And it seems wrong, but we're kind of conditioned to think like, oh no, this is just what you have to do, but it'll be worth it. But for so many people, it's not. And for yourself also, it's not very worth it either. So yeah, finding those connections, but within school as well. Like if we're preparing for the outside world, like kind of bring it in here too. Because we have to adapt to it at some point. It's not like we just learn in blocks, like all of this intersects. That's the word of the day, I guess. Like, it's just really, really important. And anybody can speak because there's just so much to touch on with this. And we can go a little bit over, it's all right.
Okay, so I think you're so right. And Roxy, same here. Like I completely agree with you. And the way it works, like I from what I remember when I was a kid is we'd be given this one aptitude test, and we'd be told, "Okay, this is what you can become. Everything else you'd really suck at. You really should not pursue that." And we even had teachers who would look at things I do and be like, "Oh, you really aren't cut out for this." And the fact that our system is one that's filtering people out in those ways, as opposed to giving them skills or tools to actually do better in the things that they're passionate about, I find that schools end up killing that passion so much. And overwhelming it, because it's like, hey, we're going to give you all this information that you need to retain for this exam, which has no real merit to you, but you're going to have to memorize that and forget about doing things you actually enjoy because your future is on the line. And if that's what, this is what we were talking about earlier as well, is that if this is what schools are for, and redefining that purpose, that schools should be about helping students be well-rounded, good adults. But right now, what the focus is on becoming good employees. And the thing is, not all of us want to become employees. I mean, even if it was something like, teaching someone how to start their own business, like basic things you'd need to know about starting your own business. Why is that not taught in schools? Roxy had said something about this, not here, but earlier, about, like basic skills about, like, she made a bench the other day. And it's like, oh yeah, why was I not taught these? How are these things optional, but for me to know trigonometry and differentiation and all of this, like, stuff I'll never use, mandatory. And, even just about health, right? The way health is taught in schools is in this very, like, oh, you need to go to gym class and you need to eat healthy. Those are the two things that are taught. And just our health curriculum overall is just embarrassing. In Pakistan, it's worse so because we don't talk about reproductive health at all. And that's, like, I'm sure that's an issue in Canada as well, about how reproductive health is taught. But here it's just like, oh, that just doesn't exist. You can deal with that when you get older, or let your parents tell you. And so all of these things about everything and how much our health is related to the environment. And just, we live in these concrete jungles, and the impact that, nature has on us, and being able to be learning in an environment that is surrounded by nature makes such a difference in us as personalities, in our mental health struggles, even the impact of nature on, anxiety, depression, it's huge. And the fact that our schools are so disconnected from that, but, we'll have this, like, really properly trimmed grass in the soccer field or this basketball court or something like that, that's really not the kind of greenery that we need. So yeah, there's so much room for what our curriculums can do, even around food and food security. Oh yeah, just, we can go on about this. I'm gonna that's all I have to say for now.
Yeah, Ella, feel free to touch on this as well, because we're both students in high school. This can all seem really overwhelming, but it's super duper important. And yeah, I think just to add on to that passion thing, because that is quite a large and important topic. It's what keeps a lot of us going. I know that, at least for me, I've always had a little bit of difficulty learning compared to other people. And that was difficult, definitely, like in a privileged elementary school, thinking that you're just different, but that's cool. Just keep going with the normal, because the normal is going to let you go somewhere. But I'm glad that, in high school, I've had like learning strategies and all this cool stuff to help me. But at the same time, it's always been very much, if you are born with a certain skill, just run with that skill. Just run with the way that we've designed for you. But maybe the stuff that I'm inherently good at is not something that I really want to go into. If I'm interested in something and it takes me 3 more hours to learn it than the average person, that doesn't mean I should stop necessarily if I'm still passionate about learning it. And I wish that was uplifted more, because I think it would be easier to think in that way if I just heard that from some teachers, if I just heard that like uplifted a lot more. And we do a lot of work, Ella can totally speak on this as well, we do a lot of work outside of school. And so to get that support from our teachers, which we totally do have, we have good teachers, but for them to bring it into our schools as well is super duper important.
Yeah, for sure. Adding on to what Gabby said, bring it into the schools. Most people at the school know the work that I do. And so when we're in class and this comes up, the conversation is directed at me, and I'm happy to help people learn about it. But I would really like for it just to be more embedded within the education system, so that teachers can actually speak on behalf of it and not have to direct it to their student who's like 30 years younger than them. Another thing I really like, I'm really fortunate to have my brain wired in the way that schools deem right. So with the standardized testing and all that, but I found that, like, I struggle myself with math and science. My brain's not wired like logically like that. Like, cannot wrap my head around the idea that there's only one right answer there. And so I do really well in like English and history, but what I found with that is that I'm able to sort of twist the essay topics into speaking about something that I am really passionate about, and I think there needs to be more education on. So for example, our history culminating was we had to write an essay about what was it, the Third Reich, like during Germany in the 1930s, and how that's relevant today. So I wrote mine on systemic racism and how 30% of Black males in Alabama weren't able to vote because there are more Black Americans within the prison system today than there were slaves in the 1850s. I think that took my history teacher back a little bit, but just being able to sort of, I've realized that this is what I want to do. I want to like go into be an environmental lawyer or human rights lawyer and go into like the intersection between the climate crisis and human rights, because the climate crisis is a human rights crisis as well. And just be able, like, that's what I want to bring to the world. So I'm going to start now. And I get in a lot of trouble with doing it, but it's good trouble, which I'm willing to get into.
That's great. Actually, just to add on to quick, one thing you said is, you know how you said you wanted to become a lawyer? And I think that's great. And I think one of the things that happens is as students even when I was a student, our only exposure to what career fields actually exist has a lot to do with TV shows that exist. And I don't know if that's the case with you, but it's like everyone wanted to become a doctor when they saw a certain TV show, or a lawyer because they saw a certain TV show or something else. And for me, that's, I think, the biggest tragedy is that our only exposure to these actual careers comes from these romantic shows which romanticize all these fields with no actual guide, like, which don't show us, obviously for obvious reasons, what the hard work that's entailed, the not so pretty sides of all of it. And that's all that we actually ever get to see. So even though you're taking careers in civics, you're not seeing any of that in its real capacity. But yeah.
I'd also love to add just TV wise, because I can totally relate to that. When it comes to like BIPOC people learning about the climate crisis, learning in general in schools, if we are getting our like career paths technically from TV and all these romanticized versions, that's also why representation is so important, because when we don't see ourselves in anything, and I say we like extremely generally, obviously I can relate to other things more than other people, but when people don't see each other in schools and taught about really the true nature of like what a job is and kind of go into the outside world, and then not seeing it on TV as well, you can feel very, very lost. And we're not really encouraging that, like, just like keep trying it, whatever sort of interests you, and go where it takes you and work hard to get it. But oh god, there's just so much to add, but anybody can add anything just before we wrap up? Yeah.
I'm just being reminded of something that I witnessed a couple of years ago. I was working alongside some folks in a high school in Toronto that was in one of the more marginalized areas of the city. And they were working towards, all these nonprofits were getting together and talking about how they're going to support this career day at the school. And they're getting all, they're talking all like, oh, we're doing such a good job supporting the youth. And, oh, okay, great. Who's our keynote speaker for the day, for Careers Day? Oh, we got the Starbucks manager. And everyone's like, great. Oh, what a great speaker. And it continues to this day. I think about it all the time and it makes me so upset because like this is what we're showing our students that they can like achieve. Your career day keynote speaker is a Starbucks manager. Like, I'm sure they're a great person, but is that really the image of what we're putting of like, who you should be aspiring to be? And I just to add to this whole conversation of like what options our schools present to us, like even when we think about being a lawyer or like a teacher, like I never thought I'd be a teacher because I didn't identify with like the regular school system teacher, but I became an educator and I'm much more like creating my own programs and creating my own communities of teachers that can teach me and lead me in that way. Like that never crossed my mind in high school. I was never approached with any of that stuff, and like that's why I took a gap year afterwards, because I left school and I was like, I have no idea what I want to do. I don't know who I am. I don't know any skills. Can't sew a button. Can't do my taxes. Don't know what my gifts are. 12 years of school. Great. And yeah, that was my point, just to poke at these.
You got a high school diploma.
I got a high school diploma.
Right? I think also, I think one of the struggles with that also comes in BIPOC communities is about, there's a lot of emphasis. I mean, I remember it, thankfully I didn't face it so much, but a lot of my friends had this pressure about, you know, picking real careers, where you had to be a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. And those are the only like real fields. Like if you wanted to be a graphic designer, it was just like, what? Like, is that even a career? Oh, he's just going to draw stuff. Like, you know, what, you're going to end up sitting on the corner of the street and drawing? Like, you know, you'd get these kind of questions. And the fact that communities themselves are not equipped or have not seen enough people in their own communities because of the lack of support, that, okay, you know what, someone can be successful as a graphic designer or as a teacher or, you know, as an athlete, you know, those are things that really are struggles. And so more resources, definitely, I completely agree with you about representation. It becomes this struggle on both ends, for a lot of students, that definitely does not get seen.
And I think just to add on to that super duper quick, is just, yeah, okay, we're gonna wrap it up real quick. But yeah, looking at more of the system and not as much as the symptom. So not only encouraging these people, but like, let's encourage to shape the system the way we want it to be. That's super duper important. And if you just have anything on how we can support your organization before we finish up, just like let us know so people watching can know as well just how to get involved. And just thank you for this conversation.
You did. Okay, yeah, it's been a great conversation. Sorry, Nayma and I wrapped you into our 4-hour conversations that we have on the regular. But yeah, I mean, so as you said at the beginning, Nayma and I both co-founded a youth co-op in Toronto called Conscious Minds, that focuses on creating the types of learning systems and learning spaces that we want. Neither of us are active organizers with it anymore, but we're still big supporters, and you can check them out at Conscious Minds Co-op. Is their Insta handle, and on Facebook as well. They have a virtual summer camp going on over the next couple of weeks and some fun activities going on. So I definitely recommend checking them out. I would also say check out the other organization I work with, the St. James Town Community Co-op, SJT Co-op, COOP. On all the socials, we're up to some really fun stuff with food security and pushing the city towards more climate emergency food services. So we could always use a shout out, a follow, a like, and keep up to date, because yeah, we're definitely all intersected. But and Nayma, I don't know if there's anyone you want to shout out in there too.
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard because a lot of the stuff I work with is largely off of social media in very informal capacities, but just, you know, positive vibes, prayers, whatever, that you're like, any sort of like positive vibes towards greater good and work, and, you know, just all of that is great. Yeah, that's about it. I think for us, as long as we're doing our part in our own spaces, that's a lot and does enough. So that's good enough for me.
Yeah. And I mean, as well too, Gabby and Ella, has been so wonderful to like hear your experiences today as well. Thanks so much for inviting me and Nayma in, and yeah, keep shouting out to the world what kind of education that you really do want. Now is the time to claim it. Now is the time to say it's not working, so obvious, can't you see, here's what we want. And we'll keep sharing your messages.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's honestly been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us and for talking to us about this for over an hour.
Our pleasure.
Enjoy.
So I think that's it. If we didn't ask you anything that you really wanted to add in, you can feel free to do that now. If not, we will let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. We love talking to you, learned so much.
Glad we could be here for you. And anytime in the future you guys ever need anything, we're so happy to see students like you guys, that are just so driven. I wish I had more students like you here, but also when I was a student. So good luck with everything.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nayma and Roxy. This has been an amazing conversation, and it is a conversation that should be continued to anybody watching or just anybody in the climate movement or not in the climate movement. Join the movement. So yeah, thank you guys so much. Have an amazing day, and just thank you a million.